Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's show. My name is Spencer Wells. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We got a great one for you, as always. Let's take a look at what we got on the docket. We are still reacting to, processing, breaking down the Donald Trump indictment from last week. We'll take a look at some of the options that he has for possibly fighting this thing. That is going to be from the New York Times. Also, some analysis on how the 2024 GOP candidates are responding. Are they starting to hit back? How effective are their hit backs? And really why it's such a big deal that they're hitting back in the first place against some of these quote-unquote liberal attacks on the dear leader in the Republican Party. Also, we take a look at a great John Schwartz piece analyzing the Trump crimes in the grand scheme of things, of kind of presidential crimes in general. A great report, leaked report from Ken Klippenstein that has been obtained from the CIA, talking about just how little, this is kind of a common theme we've been noticing, just how little the U.S. actually knows about what its allies, how much they're giving money to, really some of the most well-funded allies. We don't know anything about what they're doing, which I think is a pretty big deal. We'll also finally get to a story that we probably should have covered long time ago, Atlanta's Cop City. We're going to break it down, tell you what it is, and why it really could get some people into trouble come November. That's all to come. Thanks so much for listening. It's Newsflash. So we are still kind of reacting and processing the Donald Trump indictment here today, as we, it's about 3-4 days, I think, since it's kind of come out. We had the time to break down. But yeah, here's some interesting kind of analysis from Alan Foyer, Maggie Haberman, and Ben Protis in the New York Times, as former President Donald Trump and his advisors have been scrambling to write to the wire to assemble a legal team for his first scheduled court appearance on Tuesday after being charged with mishandling classified documents and obstructing the government's efforts to retrieve them. But even as Trump figures out who will represent him, the lawyers he eventually does get are going to face a pretty significant challenge, which is how to fight this case where he has essentially audio recording, as we saw, as some of the details of this indictment began to come out. There's essentially audio recording that really shows he knew what he was doing was wrong. So, you may not, on the I think the political question is, kind of different than the merits, which is, you may say it's sad, but it is definitely not uncommon, because really, frankly, on the merits, he is pretty dead to rights on this case. Politically, how people will process it, again, a completely different story, but he is pretty well hammered down on this case. There's no denying that. While no one precisely knows how Trump will go about attacking the most serious charges he has faced to date, his options for using the legal system to delay the case, turn it into a political circus. Because remember, again, I think it's pretty clear and pretty interesting, because the last ones, I think, they had to really, stretch them out. The ones in New York, they really had to stretch them out and kind of manipulate them for them to even be bad enough for him to face jail time, and to make felony campaign finance fraud or something like that through, what even some of the most sympathetic analysts and experts call a bit of a stretch. This is now really not the case, as it seems to be there seems to be a bevy of kind of legal cases and legal defenses that could be made on Trump's behalf, but the reality is they're all kind of long shots. They're all kind of, they're kind of a stretch, to say the least. They include that asserting that Trump had the right to take documents from the White House and that he declassified them before leaving office. It kind of goes to some of his talk about the presidential right to just declassify things by thought, or just by writing on a piece of scratch paper, not getting anything official signed or anything like that. They could accuse the prosecutors of misconduct or try to show he's a victim of selective prosecution, and they could seek to have potentially damning evidence excluded from the trial, or try to force the government to disclose classified materials that it wanted to keep secret, which I think is a very, very interesting kind of fight to see which way they go. I think all we can say for sure is it will not be very competent. It's hard to see really remember any time where Trump's lawyers have been competent, or scored a surprising win in a case where it looked pretty dire for them. But it does seem that some of these claims here, even again, it could be difficult to sustain in court. Sam Buell, who is a former federal prosecutor and law professor at Duke University, said it was going to be difficult in general to have a federal indictment dismissed before going to trial, but that Trump and his lawyers would face an uphill battle in avoiding the case moving forward. Their options, he said, are extremely limited and highly unlikely to prevent the case from getting to a jury, which I think is pretty significant because it does kind of show that this is going to be different from the last one. There will be very likely a trial of sorts. These are some of the kind of preliminary efforts, some of which they're talking about here, which is to try to stop the case from even getting to trial. But it seems very, according to, expert analysis, which, can take it with a grain of salt. But it does kind of seem to pretend here that it is very unlikely for the case to get to jury length. The former president has long used lawyers as public relations aides, deploying them to make arguments that are often better suited to the campaign trail than the courtroom. But with the stakes immeasurably higher this time, probably any time since he's been kind of in public political life, or political life, to be clear, the challenge will be to strike a balance between doing their clients' bidding and keeping to those things called criminal rules, like the rules of criminal procedure, which always has been a bit of a struggle for Trump. He's apparently hunkering down to discuss possible new lawyers after James Trusty and John Rowley, the two had been representing Trump most actively in dealing with the special counsel Jack Smith, resigned after charges were filed. The day after charges were filed, which is, again, the tier of Trump's lawyers has been just going down exponentially. Not even when he was in the White House did a lot of people in Washington really want to represent him, but now that he is in, past White House, past January 6th, past, so many different kind of so much different kind of craziness and humiliation, is going to be kind of interesting to see. It's going to be kind of interesting to see how things turn out here on the legal front. Again, take this. The key thing here is politically, it is way different from the legal reality here, which I think is a pretty big deal. A very damning indictment, said Bill Barr on Fox News Sunday. Many of the tactics available to Trump's defense have drawbacks, which is going to be one of probably the biggest deals and one of the things that kind of stop him from defending, or the kind of the defense of this. Two people familiar with Trump's legal team said that his lawyers may file a motion to suppress the notes. The lawyer M. Evan Corcoran made of his conversations with the former president about helping him comply with the federal subpoena from May 2022, demanding the return of all classified documents in his possession, which could be damning because, again, he did not return said documents in May 2022, or really until the FBI raid, which was later, I think, in 2022. So, again, the big question that kind of everyone wants to know is jail, which I haven't really found. It seems like the maximum term is 10 years imprisonment. The indictment notes the charges carry a maximum term of 10 years imprisonment. 4 other counts related to conspiracy or withholding or concealing the documents each carry maximum sentences of 20 years, which could be a pretty bad deal. It's unlikely if he does go, which is still very unlikely, that he will go for that long, but that kind of does put things in perspective. We talked about the legal. Now let's switch gears to the political, where we have seen a pretty interesting, as far as kind of the polling here, as with the people is kind of concerned. CBS News has a new poll out that kind of goes through it. Republican primary voters are saying they're, quote, far more concerned, this again CBS News, that Donald Trump's indictment is politically motivated than his alleged conduct being a national security risk, and there is no evidence. Because, again, I think this is kind of the message that a lot of the Republicans will see here that will really help him with the nomination, at least, is that there is no, because of he didn't, sell off the documents for, God knows what. He just showed them to people in Mar-a-Lago, at least one or two. What we have seen from this indictment thus far, he just was showing around, flexing a little bit to people in Mar-a-Lago. A lot of them are just saying, yeah, it's politically motivated and isn't really a kind of a national security risk. Again, it's among likely GOP primary voters, 76% say, to the response to the question, which concerns you more, 76% say the indictment was politically motivated, and just 12% say that the documents were a national security risk concerns them more, which is pretty remarkable, at least kind of in the context of the GOP primary, which really kind of does show you that the status that Trump is in. In fact, most Republican voters, primary voters, would not generally consider him keeping the alleged documents with nuclear systems or military plans to be a national security risk in and of itself. Just 38% are saying yes to the question, national security risk, that it would be a national security risk if Trump kept nuclear or military documents, compared to 80% of the rest of the country. Again, this is something that, if the election were going to be held tomorrow, it's not good by any stretch of the imagination, but it will not be. So again, something to kind of keep, kind of bookmark and kind of come back later. I feel like most explicitly ruled out the charges announced in the indictment, changing their views about Trump, which I think is probably pretty accurate. Because most people, if they like him, they're going to still like him after this. If they don't like him, again, opinion on Trump, pretty polarized one way or the other, even with people who are kind of checked out from politics in general. 61% say their opinion will not change. And if convicted over classified documents, Trump should, even if convicted, still be able to be president. Which is pretty interesting there. Let's take a look at some of the Republican primary polls, some of the latest polls as of of June 12th. He has had a bit of a late or kind of a recent surge. He is now from around 56 to 61, gained about 4 points in the most recent YouGov poll related to the poll from about a week before in the Morning Consult, where Trump is at 56 just about a week ago or 2 weeks ago. It is now around 61 in comparison to DeSantis. Let's see here. Not a lot of great stuff here, but it does seem that he is kind of surging a little bit. But here is how is it going to be interesting to see is, so far some of the most, I think, probably effective, at least primary attacks, not to say it's also relative, of course, but probably some of the most effective primary attacks thus far have been via Ron DeSantis in the Republican primary, simply because of the fact that they are, attacks from the right, not attacks from the left, or echoing some of the things that liberals have said about him in the past, or about Trump in the past, or are currently saying now. This indictment, if Republicans really choose to go after him over the indictment, I think it'll be interesting, because that is going to, it looks like they will be teaming up in a big way with some of the liberals out there to try and kind of shut this down. The GOP's reaction to the indictment has been generally to focus more upon the supposed double standard in the justice system, the purported weaponization of government, while avoiding addressing the merits of the case against Trump, even to defend him. But the merits have begun to seep into their commentary. So this is from Monday this afternoon. Both Tim Scott and former UN ambassador Nikki Haley went further by suggesting that maybe Trump actually did do something wrong. Scott called it a serious case with serious allegations, which is pretty interesting, because he is, the speculation was he was really running to be Trump's VP. And, if that is not necessarily the position you want to be in, with Trump in this absolute loyalty type of situation, honestly, if I were him, I would just kind of be happy to be kind of sitting plumb up in the Senate, and not be just abused by Trump 24/7. We saw kind of what happened with Mike Pence there, but both layered their commentary with allusions to the idea the process was unfair. Nikki Haley said, if the indictment is true, if what it says is actually the case, President Trump is incredibly reckless with our national security. So there, two things could be. It's not mutually exclusive, which is probably pretty weak in most circumstances, including this one. Because of the fact, the fact is that it's not something that's going to satisfy Republican voters. It can't be unfair, but also very serious at the same time. That is just not how it works. Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson, just people who have really no shot of winning or kind of challenging Trump, or really even being significant threats, beyond 0 to 2% in the Trump or kind of anti-Trump kind of lane led by DeSantis and all those people. Those are they don't really even have that much of a shot of getting in that lane. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis also criticized the process over the weekend, but on Friday said he would have been court-martialed. I would have been court-martialed in a New York minute if he had taken classified documents while serving in the military. Former VP Mike Pence also tacitly conceded that it's possible the evidence is just that significant, saying before the indictment that, quote, I don't know the facts of the former president's case. He also repeatedly emphasized that no one is above the law. Again, not even going as far as to say that includes Trump, but assuming that's obviously implied. Again, none of this is the full-throated denunciation. Much of it is still hesitant, but it does show that they have, and I think really, it does show that they're just still playing both sides of the coin here. Meanwhile, John Schwartz has a pretty great piece on this, writing, I may have let out a weird animalistic hoot of joy when news broke that President Trump was being indicted on former federal charges. There's something about Trump's essence that maddens all former children who long ago always did the assigned reading, only to see their lazy bully classmate bloviate their way into the Ivy League thanks to their rich dad. At long last, he's paying the price for not following the rules, we think. And yet, there's something discordant about hearing the former New York Times, from the New York Times, that this is, quote, the first time a former U.S. president has faced federal charges. It's the first time that this has happened, putting it kind of in perspective. Your disquiet may grow if you truly consider that no U.S. president has ever been impeached, convicted, and removed from office. Richard Nixon was not even impeached. He resigned before the House could vote after the Judiciary Committee approved 3 articles of impeachment. Bill Clinton was impeached and Trump was impeached twice, but both were acquitted in their Senate trials. How can this be? Trump is extremely bad, and honestly, I'm still smiling today as I imagine him screaming unfair at the squirrels. Unfair at the squirrels on his New Jersey golf course, but it makes no sense to believe that he's the only president in American history who's ever acted so maliciously that he deserves to face some potential consequences. And he, to kind of illustrate this point, this is why John Schwartz of The Intercept, again, is so brilliant. He goes to Murder on the Orient Express, which was the 1934 mystery by Agatha Christie. In the novel, in case you don't know, Detective Hercule Poirot boards the famous train in Istanbul. There are only 14 passengers in first and second class. On the second night, the train is forced to stop in Croatia due to a huge snowdrift. And the next morning, a business person named Samuel Ratchet is discovered dead in his cabin, indicating the killer must still be on board. The evidence is peculiar. Ratchet has been stabbed 12 times, but some of the wounds appear to have been inflicted by someone who's right-handed, and some appear to be from someone who is left-handed. Some came from someone extremely strong, some from someone extremely weak. And a fusillade of other clues point to different suspects on the scene. So Poirot, maybe a bit of a spoiler here, considers it all and then gathers all the possible top suspects together. Well, this is kind of the Benoit Blanc, Knives Out mystery. I think there was this in a movie a few years back. So the victim, he suggests that there were 2 theories of the case. A, the victim was murdered by someone who's no longer on the train, who somehow got on board and then escaped unnoticed. Ratchet. 2, Ratchet was murdered by everyone. All the passengers had a motive to kill them. Each one stabbed him, and no individual can rationally be held responsible, separate from the others. Poirot says he'll let his friend decide which theory makes the most sense. After pondering it briefly, his friend says it must have been the unknown stranger, and that's what he'll tell the police. This is American politics, and politics generally in miniature, and why it's nearly impossible for societies to punish the perpetrators of great crimes. Anything terrible on a large scale demands broad elite endorsement and participation. When it comes to major evils, most people at the top must be guilty for it to happen in the first place, and so everyone gets away with it. It kind of goes with the same principle. They can't punish everyone. They can't get us all at the same time. That wouldn't be bad, or just would make things too crazy. But achieving this body count, far greater than any serial killer could ever dream of, obviously requires, again, this body count, meaning the really just the slaughter of American imperialism, as Schwartz cites specifically the Vietnam War, 2 to 4 million people was the number. Again, it seems crazy, right? It obviously requires buy-in for far more people than just these two presidents. How could any legitimate justice process convict just Johnson and Nixon? The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed 416 to 0 and 88 to 2 in the House and Senate, respectively, and Congress firmly voted to fund the war for years, or to take the war on terror, which appears to have caused 4.5 million deaths. The post-9/11 authorization for use of military force flew through Congress, with even a lone House member voting against it. Even Bernie Sanders voted yes. 296 members of the House and 77 members voted for war with Iraq. As in Murder on the Orient Express, there was a lot of stabbing by a lot of people. The dynamic holds true to an extent when a society is conquered even. The Nuremberg trial includes prosecutions of some of the most famous Nazi officials, but over 3,000 potential cases, most were dropped, and by the 1950s, those sentenced to prison had almost all been released because, this is a little organic hidden history plug to go back to season 3, where we talked about Operation Paperclip, but because the U.S. needed German elites to help us run Germany, and some of those German elites were Nazis. The trials of Japanese war criminals were even less consequential for the same reason, with Emperor Hirohito explicitly excluded from any possible responsibility. However, it is occasionally possible for societies to address minor crimes that major figures commit by themselves or with a small circle of cronies. Trump, and his big mistake, was doing just that. He didn't get enough people in on the scheme, and the scheme didn't benefit enough people, so therefore he's kind of just been singled out and really cast out, I think, which is a really great way of analyzing it from John Schwartz. We talk CIA and Iran and Israel next.
MC, make another hit.
This ain't what you want. Project. This ain't what you want. This ain't what you want.
You're listening to Newsflash right here on the Spencer Walsh Radio Network. Help us grow our audience. Subscribe, rate, and review our show on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for listening today to Newsflash right here on the Spencer Walsh Radio Network. It's a pleasure to have you with us here as we get into our last two stories. Ken Klippenstein in the Intercept with another real banger coming out today, which is quite, Israel and Iran. It's about Israel and Iran. They really have been at each other's throats, and especially with the American refusal to engage with Iran over nuclear diplomacy, especially after pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal done under Trump, and the refusal by by Joe Biden to even consider picking up on one of the best things that his former president did. Biden has kind of just let the situation deteriorate in kind of the same way. And now, and I guess this is kind of one of my most controversial political takes, but understandably, frankly, Iran is on the verge of, if you look at it from realism, from great power politics, whatever, their own personal beneficial perspective, beneficially and understandably for them, they are on the course of getting another nuke. Because if you're Iran and you're looking at, the world as is, how North Korea has been treated when they kept their nukes, how Libya was treated when they gave, quote unquote, give up their nukes, it really makes sense. If you want guarantees of assurance, guarantees of protection from America, or, some sort of relative protection from America, you're not really going to get out of the sanctions. And, really the conduct of the United States has really made that clear. But you can get a kind of protection from the degree of just quote unquote fuckery that the United States always is going to give some certain countries, the official enemies of the state. So they are kind of really working and pushing on their nuclear program. Israel is our, satellite country, some would say, in the region. And while Israel's escalating threats of a war with Iran over its nuclear program are saber-rattling, or something more serious is a mystery even to the CIA, as they seem to, kind of be following U.S. interests, but not even the U.S. knows really what their kind of grand plans are, because frankly, they are following their own interests as well. It's not like, Israel is some a complete satellite state. They are very well developed. They have their own kind of very powerful intelligence agency that really goes for its own interests, not explicitly controlled by the United States, as some other very powerful, very similar intelligence agencies have been in the past. We have seen Israel's definitely not a country to kind of be trifled with, or it has not been for a very long time on the international stage. But it really also does kind of seem that on the grand scheme of things, the United States does not really know and cannot really kind of confirm what Israel's grand plans are, according to the CIA, which is kind of a bit surprising, because I've kind of long speculated in this situation. Ukraine, Saudi Arabia, two other examples of a very common theme, which is the United States paying a bunch of money to countries, and the countries essentially telling them, F off, we'll do whatever we want. It's kind of, they have been claiming that they're not really in the dark, and I've kind of been a little bit skeptical, because they are kind of eventually following what is U.S. interest in the end. But this kind of changes my perspective a little bit, because this is really a leaked internal CIA report about Israel, according to a portion of a top secret intelligence report leaked on the platform Discord earlier this year. It's from the Discord leaks by Jack Teixeira, this guy who was, again, at the beginning of the year, was arrested, and the uncertainty about the intentions of U.S. closest allies calls into question the basis of the ironclad support for Israel publicly espoused by Biden administration. The report, which was first covered by the Israeli channel I-24 News and subsequently posted by DDoS Secrets, a group that publishes leaked documents, reveals an undisclosed military exercise conducted by Israel. On the 20th of February, Israel conducted a large-scale exercise, the intelligence report said, which was produced by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence on February 23rd. The exercise, it said, was probably to simulate a strike on Iran's nuclear program and possibly to demonstrate Jerusalem's resolve to act against Tehran, which, I don't think would really deter anything, except for, the fact that there isn't a war. There would be a war pretty darn soon if Iran, or if Israel decided to strike Tehran to try and quote unquote deter them from starting a nuclear weapon. I really think that the opposite effect would happen, as Iran would probably get incredibly more freaked out, try and speed up their process for kind of this kind of nuclear guarantee, this mutually assured destruction kind of narrative that they can really easily kind of go into, and not to mention again, some sort of conflict between, either direct or through militias, or kind of, some type of situation, would probably start pretty soon. But the exercise, it was probably simply, again, a strike on Iran's nuclear program and to possibly demonstrate Jerusalem's resolve to act against Tehran. There have been several joint U.S.-Israeli exercises in recent months, including one proudly billed by the Pentagon as the largest in history. The CIA does not know Israel's near-term plans and intentions, the report adds, speculating, again, why don't we just phone tap them like we do with everyone else? I don't know. Maybe the NSA is doing that, and this kind of hasn't. This is maybe at lower levels, because I really find it hard to imagine that they don't know about anything like this, at least especially in the short term. But it kind of speculates that Netanyahu probably calculates Israel will need to strike Iran to deter its nuclear program and faces declining military capability to set back the Iranian enrichment program. That the U.S.'s premier intelligence service indicated that it has no idea how seriously to take Israel's increasingly bombastic threats to Tehran means that, in all likelihood, neither does the White House. But despite this lack of clarity, Biden has not opposed unilateral Israeli attack on Iran, as National Security Advisor recently hinted at blessing it. We have made clear to Iran that it can never be permitted to obtain a nuclear weapon, Jake Sullivan said in a speech earlier this month, reiterating the administration's oft-repeated line. The rhetoric reflects what military planners call strategic ambiguity, a policy of intentional uncertainty in order to deter an adversary, in this case, around how far the U.S. might go to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. But Sullivan went a step further, adding, as President Biden has repeatedly affirmed, he will take the actions that are necessary to stand by the statement, including by recognizing Israel's freedom of action. So kind of essentially saying maybe some sort of plausible deniability here, but Israel will essentially support you doing whatever you want, because you have the freedom of action. Sullivan's statement represents the strongest signal yet. The administration will not oppose unilateral action by Israel, which is a very, very interesting dynamic. But I think really is something that is worthy of more reporting is the fact, what does the U.S. know? Who in the U.S., pretty labyrinthian deep state power structure, who in this power structure would kind of endorse this? Who would kind of pass along? Would they just let Israel do their thing for possible deniability? Would some endorse it? Would some not? It's that landscape, that power web, this decision-making web, I think needs to be sussed out a little bit more. To have a full understanding of the situation, but this is definitely something to keep, in my opinion, a pretty close eye on. All right, wasting no time getting into our last story here. Last week, as Atlanta was absorbing yet another piece of bad news about its snake-bit proposal for a new police and fire training facility, quote, which is that it would cost the public twice as much as had been discussed. For a little bit of an update on that, the Cop City proposal. For this new police and fire training facility, which is just outside Atlanta, which is cuts down acres upon acres of forest land to train police in quote unquote urban warfare. That proposal had passed, but MSNBC post Chris Hayes, a kind of nominal defender of kind of police and establishment interests, certainly a critic of defund the police when it was out there. He had an interesting quote. He said, "I have to say, I followed this story from afar, and only moderately closely, but I remain mystified why Atlanta officials are just so intent on building this thing." He tweeted, "City first accepted the proposal to build the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center, Cop City in the vernacular, a $90 million, 85-acre campus just outside the city proper, while crime was rising in 2021, but also while the wounds of George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks and the protests were still healing. A multi-million-dollar police training center in the middle of a forest with little transparency or recourse for voters felt like a slap in the face of the people who had been marching Atlanta flat for democracy. The plan calls for the city to pay about $33 million today and another $1.2 million a year for the next 30 years to cover debt for the entity building it, which is a pretty sizable chunk of the budget. The Atlanta Police Foundation has said the public cost is about twice as high as reported in late 2021, and you can expect the cost to probably balloon, knowing how just the way things are generally built in America, the cost to balloon over time. Again, this is was first reported in 2021 and comes really after nearly 2 years of strident opposition by residents and activists far and wide. City officials are quietly arguing this case was always going to be this was always going to be the cost, and that everyone has simply been mistaken, despite no real effort to correct that mistake. Before local journalists at the Atlanta Community Press Collective dug closely through the figures, but Atlanta City Council still voted for the Cop City proposal by a vote of 11-4. Anticipating potential disruption, Mayor Andre Dickens closed the City Hall for regular business on Monday and banned outside liquids in the building, airport security style. Dozens of cops, which is kind of weird, like liquids. I don't know. Dozens of cops hovered at the edges of City Hall's atrium for hundreds of people waited for hours and hours for their turn to voice their opposition. This is, again, during this kind of city council meeting. Virtually everyone here stood against the proposal. Moments after the vote, activists shouted threats at city council members. At one point, an activist lunged over the railing between the crowd and the dais to shout, quote, "I will fucking find your ass," at council member Jason Winston, as a ring of cops separated the two. The short answer to today's question is that officials don't think their practical alternatives to replace the city's ad hoc, dilapidated, unsupervised facilities are any better. And they believe that people aren't angry because of a dispute over Cop City's cost or environmental challenges associated with building the land, but because the city's messaging was badly bungled. Critically, City Hall leaders believe that the potential electoral blowback is limited. In another city, a training facility might be a parochial argument, but like all things in Atlanta politics, the state and national political forces come to bear. Georgia is all too often the center of the political universe, and conflict descends upon it like up-tempo cicadas in the summer. So breaking it down here, we got the kind of, you got your political kind of police abolitionists kind of on one side, who really see this as just a base insult to their city and have really just made this kind of their kind of dying line. Graffiti declaring that Cobb City will never be built, ornaments the famed Krog Street tunnel, overpasses, subway pylons, and street signs. This energy and political activism, a product of 4 years of hard-fought progressive politics in the state and the city, organically suffuses their message as an appeal to both Atlanta's left-leaning public and as a national call to fight. Directly opposite the abolitionists stands a decidedly Republican opponent, Attorney General Chris Carr. By the way, there is some pretty. It's important to note that all the Atlanta city council members voted for this, which are Democrat. All 11 are Democrat. By the way, pretty important thing to note there. They are being backed up by the Republican Chris Carr. 8 of the Democrats voted to pass the ordinance, and at least 12 of the city's 15 council members are Democrats. Let's be accurate there about the facts. My apologies. Carr is, again, politically ambitious prosecutor, will almost certainly run for higher office in 2026. He's not exactly counting on the Atlanta vote to propel him to the governor's mansion. To the degree that Cobb City is a political question, Carr wants to show the statewide Republican primary audience that he's willing to confront, quote-unquote, Antifa. And then, of course, we got the Georgia police, who have really seen this as a pretty big threat to them, or the protests, is a pretty big threat to them. This is both in Georgia and abroad, in Atlanta and abroad, as it was Georgia State Patrolmen, remember, that shot Manuel Tortuguita Terán in January near the Cobb City site, which really set off a whole new wave of protests. Then, which was really crazy, on Thursday, police raided a house near the facility, which had been an activist staging ground for the protests. Cops picked up 3 activists, Marlon Scott Couts, Adele McLean, and Savannah Patterson of, the first 2 were of Atlanta, and Savannah Patterson was of Savannah. Each were charged with money laundering and charities fraud. The arrest introduced another challenge to the progressive credentials of city leaders of Atlanta, an attack on the mechanisms of protest in a city historically defined by the civil rights struggle. But while Atlanta police officers conducted the arrest, it was Carr's office who drove them. The Georgia Bureau of Investigations officers swore out the arrest warrants before a DeKalb County Superior Court judge, describing the 3 activists as part of a group classified by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security as violent domestic extremists. Again, this is some of the new terrorism predictions post-January 6th, again, that we see coming to play here. Also, again, obviously around the war and terror as well. Notably, though, in the case of the activists, even the judge is unimpressed with the case against them. On the political question here, obviously a lot remains to be determined, but the thing is, the people who held down the chairs in the hall for 16 hours awaiting the funding vote, really just yelling at members of the city council to stop this, as is their democratic right, are often the same people who knock on doors and phone bank and raise money during election season. The impact of the vote isn't likely to change much about the competition of the Atlanta City Council, but it could impact the 2024 presidential race in Georgia, and by extension, given Georgia's newfound swing state status. it may not change the composition of the city council because a lot of the districts, as it's pretty well put here in this Intercept article, most Atlanta residents are neither policing abolitionists nor cop cheerleaders. Many neighborhoods, including the majority black, overwhelmingly Democratic communities on Atlanta's west side, measure the city by its responsiveness to neighborhood blight, traffic problems, and crime. Conceptually, a police training center isn't inherently controversial to most Atlantans. It also isn't being built in any of their backyards. Rather than muddle through when the city's acrimonious planning device, city leaders alighted on a plan to build Cop City on city-owned land that wasn't actually in the city, but in a neighboring county. A quirk in state law allows them to sidestep the normal planning and zoning processes that way. Unsurprisingly, though, the most vocal neighborhood-level opposition has come from the city council district closest to the Cop City site, which is the 5th district of Atlanta City Council, held by Liliana Bakhtiari. Four of the other 9 districts show significant opposition, political observers say. When the Cop City budget proposal came out for discussion in Atlanta City Council 2 weeks ago, hundreds of opponents came in a line winding through the marble halls and onto the street. The chamber recorded 7 hours of public comment with not one single speaker in favor of the project, saying, "Your hands are tied, you are not the rope," said Rohit Malhotra, a founder and executive director of the Center for Civic Action in Atlanta, among the last of speakers at 3:20 a.m. of the night. But city council members voting for the facility, to fund the facility, believe the opposition is just too diffuse in the remaining districts. Again, it kind of is this kind of ambient, something needs to be done about this crime sentiment to really create an opening for a challenger in their districts. And city council members believe there's a distinction to be made between the highly motivated activists enjoying the spectacle of freewheeling public comment and the quiet masses who don't attend hearings at city council. And I think it's going to be up to Atlanta activists to really make that difference. There's 2 political impacts to this. I think the Georgia-wide impact and the demotivation, the disrespect towards the Democratic grassroots base is definitely going to be something that could come back to bite them. But I also think it's going to be on the activists when things come down to it in the city to really stand up to some of this pressure. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back on Wednesday.